I'm going to talk about how you, the interpreter, can set up your equipment and your software to remotely interpret a hearing that is already itself remote. At an in-person hearing, you'll have a judge, a couple of attorneys, and in this case, an LEP participant, a limited English proficient participant. And if there is an LEP participant, you're likely to have an interpreter. What's different about a remote hearing is that all of these people are likely to be in different places. It's the court's responsibility to set up the video conference for the hearing. Once they do that, they'll send invitations to all the participants, and each participant will join when it comes time for the hearing, including the interpreter. When it comes time for the interpreter to interpret, their non-English interpretation goes through their WebEx connection into the WebEx court hearing, and then that interpretation comes down to the LEP participant through their WebEx connection, and then any non-English response they have goes back up through their connection, through the hearing, and back down to the interpreter through their connection. So both languages are moving back and forth through the same channel. We call this a single channel architecture. And the difficulty with that is that everyone has the same kind of WebEx connection to the hearing, and so everyone is hearing both the English and the non-English. And because everyone's hearing both languages, a hearing conducted in this way has to be interpreted in the consecutive mode. Now, for most of the hearings that we interpret in court, this is just fine, because most hearings we interpret are short and relatively simple. And so the consecutive mode works just fine. But if a hearing comes along that by its nature is longer or more complicated, for example, a restraining order hearing that's contested, or a motions hearing, that kind of thing, the interpreter really needs to be able to move back and forth between the consecutive mode and the simultaneous mode as appropriate in order for the court to be able to operate with the best efficiency possible. What we want to have is a dual channel architecture. We want to separate the two languages onto independent channels, independent lines. And when each language is on an independent line, one the English line, one the non-English line, then simultaneous interpretation is possible. So how are we going to do that? Well, first of all, the interpreter is going to link to the WebEx court hearing the same way everyone else does, through the WebEx software on their computer. We're going to call that the English line. Now the interpreter needs to establish the non-English line. And to do that, we're going to use cell phones, just a simple cell phone call. And that will be the non-English line. Okay, so that's the theory behind the dual channel architecture, but how does it work in real life? How do we actually accomplish simultaneous interpreting on a remote video hearing? The first thing the interpreter does is set up their own equipment. They plug a headset with microphone into the computer. This is how they'll be communicating with the court hearing. We recommend a separate headset with microphone because it improves the sound quality, both the sound that the interpreter hears from the court, and also it improves the quality of the interpreter's voice going back into the court hearing. Some interpreters are tempted to use the built-in speakers and microphone on the computer, and we really don't recommend that. The audio quality is poor and also can often cause distortion, everything from feedback to echoes to a kind of ringing sound. So definitely a separate headset with microphone. Next, the interpreter plugs a set of earbuds into their phone. They'll be using the earbuds to communicate through the phone to the LEP participant. And they put one of the earbuds into one of their ears. Now it's time for the interpreter to make a connection to the court hearing, and they do that through their computer, through the WebEx software. When the interpreter first joins the hearing, it's possible, depending on how the court has set up the hearing, that they will be automatically muted, that the court won't be able to hear them. So that's something the interpreter wants to check. Now, if you look closely at the image of the young woman on the laptop there, you'll see two dots, a red and a green one. Those are control buttons that are part of the WebEx software. I'm going to expand those now so we can talk about them for a moment. The button that's furthest on the left is the audio mute button. And if that's red when the interpreter signs in, that means the interpreter's voice is muted and the court can't hear them. So you'll want to check that. If it is red, you click it and it'll turn gray, and then the interpreter's voice channel will be open and they can communicate with the court at the appropriate moment to let the court know they're there, they're ready to go. So that setup, the headset through the computer, through the WebEx line to the court, we'll call that the English line. Now it's time for the interpreter to establish the non-English line. Before the interpreter calls the LEP participant, the interpreter wants the user code *67 to block their phone number from appearing on the participant's phone. You enter the code *67, then the LEP participant's phone number, and then click dial, thus establishing the non-English line. So, how does the interpreter operate this system to interpret simultaneously? Well, let's say something said in English in the court hearing. That English statement travels down the WebEx line into the interpreter's computer, into their headset, and in this case, the interpreter hears it in their left ear. The interpreter's first instinct is to want to interpret that into the non-English language for the LEP participant. But the interpreter can't do that. And they can't do that because, don't forget, they're wearing two microphones. The microphone back to the WebEx conference, the court hearing, is still active. And so if they go ahead and render the non-English interpretation, that interpretation is going to reflect back into the court hearing. Everyone will hear it, and the interpreter can't interpret simultaneously that way. So what the interpreter needs to do is they need to somehow mute the sound that's going into the headset microphone. And they do that using the mute button that we talked about a few minutes ago. The interpreter is going to use that WebEx control button to mute the sound going back into the hearing. So what does that look like? Well, there's our English statement coming down the WebEx line and into the interpreter's computer. The interpreter hears that, but before they render the non-English interpretation, they click on the mute button on their WebEx screen. That prevents their voice from going back into the court hearing, and then the interpreter renders the non-English interpretation for the LEP participant. That's what permits simultaneous interpretation. And most of the interpreting we do in a court hearing goes in this direction. It's a lot of talking, judges talking, lawyers talking, witnesses, that kind of thing. A lot of English coming down, being interpreted into the non-English language. So this works well. But at some point, the LEP participant is going to want to say something in response to a question, a comment, whatever. That LEP participant is going to make a non-English statement. The interpreter will hear it through, in this case, the earbud in their right ear. But before that interpreter renders an interpretation into English, they have to unmute their line back into the court hearing. So they unmute their line and then render their interpretation through the WebEx channel back into the court hearing. Now, also don't forget, there's still two microphones that are active at this time. So as they're rendering the English interpretation for the court, that English interpretation is also going back to the LEP participant. So at this point, the interpreter has to switch from simultaneous interpreting to consecutive interpreting. But that's okay, because generally when people in the hearing are talking directly to the LEP participant and the LEP participant is responding, the interpreter does move into the consecutive mode when they're in the courtroom in person. So here, interpreting consecutively is really not a problem. Now, technically, the interpreter could mute their voice on the phone using the mute button on their telephone. That would prevent the English interpretation from reflecting back to the LEP participant. But at this point, it's just another layer of complexity, and the interpreter's already working harder than they would be if they were there in the courtroom in person. And so we feel the benefit isn't worth the cost. Okay, to review what we just talked about. In the simplest terms, when the interpreter hears English, their first reaction should be to mute the English line and then render the non-English interpretation. When the interpreter hears the non-English language, their reaction should be to unmute the English line and render the English interpretation. Now let's talk about some special situations. The first one is attorney-client consultation, which is privileged communication, which means no one else on the hearing should be able to hear anything that the interpreter is interpreting between the LEP participant and their attorney. And this system handles that pretty well. The first thing the interpreter has to do is mute their line into the court hearing. Now we need some cooperation from the attorney. They need to mute their line, and then now the interpreter and the attorney have to make a separate telephone connection. It can go either way. The interpreter can put the LEP participant's call on hold, dial the attorney, and then once the attorney answers, merge the two calls. That puts all three people, LEP participant, attorney, and interpreter, on the same line, and from there the consultation is interpreted consecutively. Depending on your telephone, your smartphone, some phones will allow the outside incoming call to be merged. It depends on your phone, but pretty much every smartphone will allow the interpreter to call the attorney and then merge the two. Another special circumstance is when the LEP participant has their own direct connection to the WebEx court hearing. Some LEP participants want to be able to see and hear what's going on in the hearing in English. Some courts require a LEP participant to be visible on the screen and or their original non-English statements to be part of the record in addition to the interpreter's English interpretations. Those are not our considerations as interpreters. That's for other people to decide. But that direct connection from the LEP participant to the court hearing via WebEx, that can cause some technical problems for the interpreter, actually can cause technical problems for everybody involved in the hearing. Things like the feedback, the ringing noise, ghost voices, or echoing. And the interpreter can suggest some things to help resolve those problems if they happen. First is that the LEP participant mute their WebEx line anytime they're not directly speaking into the court hearing. Judges may be aware of this and be asking everyone on the hearing to mute their lines when they're not actually speaking to the hearing. The other thing, and the thing that kind of works really well, is for the interpreter to request that the LEP participant turn off the speaker function on their phone and hold the phone to their ear or to use earbuds on their end of the non-English line. Actually, the earbuds work very well because they keep the sound for each channel separate and they don't mix, and that's what causes most of the audio problems. Okay, so that's the dual channel architecture, how it works, how to set it up, and how to operate it while you're interpreting during a hearing. It is a lot of information, but actually the system is very simple once you have it set up. You're just clicking mute or unmute again and again, depending on which language you're hearing. English, mute; non-English language, unmute. What it takes, though, is it takes practice. You got to just train those muscles. It's got to be a reflex that you have to develop, and that takes practice. It doesn't take a lot of practice. Most people who are kind of comfortable with technology and computers and stuff, it'll take them 5 or 10 minutes, just a couple of rounds, a few rounds through of, okay, that's English, mute, interpret into the other language, and then, I hear the other language, unmute, interpret into English. You do that a few times and it kind of, something clicks in your head and you're able to do it from then on. So I suggest you find some friends or colleagues to practice this with. Start some kind of video conference. It can be Zoom. It doesn't have to be WebEx. And just practice muting and unmuting for different languages. Do a little bit of practice for that, and then when it comes time for your hearing, you'll be ready. And if the hearing is of any length at all, by the time you're done with that hearing, it'll be a very rote response, and you'll be able to handle it without difficulty. Thanks for listening.